When World War III kicks off, you will be in the firing line, especially if Uncle Sam has anything to say about it. With tensions escalating across the globe, a lot of young men, and more than a few parents, are asking the same question: is the draft coming back? And if it does, is there any hope for someone whose only combat experience is racking up kills in Halo? Find out how to avoid being drafted in World War III on this episode of The Infographic Show. Conscription first began in the United States during the Civil War, as first the Confederacy and then the Union called up young men to defend the border. This created the terrifying scenario that a loyal son of the Union living in the Confederacy could be drafted by what he viewed as an enemy army. In the North, the draft wasn't truly for everyone. The wealthy could pay a fee to get out of it, something Abraham Lincoln famously did to protect his oldest son. This wasn't an obligation that was easy to get out of. Dodging the draft was considered desertion, punishable by death, although Lincoln was famous for pardoning those accused. And this draft would be the first of many. Smaller conflicts like the Spanish-American War didn't feature a draft, but the huge scale of the First World War and Second World War necessitated it, essentially the two-front war of the latter. The First World War saw about 2.8 million men drafted, and World War II saw a shocking 10 million drafted. These were seen as existential conflicts, and much of an entire generation served. In fact, many men older than the draft age volunteered, and even some teenagers lied about their age to enlist early. And when the wars ended, so did the draft. But it wouldn't stay gone for long. While there was no armed military conflict after World War II, the specter of the Cold War and potential World War III with the Soviet Union led the government to institute a rare peacetime draft, conscripting a smaller percentage of military-aged men to be trained and go where the government needs them. This famously included Elvis Presley, who took 2 years off at the height of his career to serve his country. While no wars were declared, the men drafted under this regime would end up serving in the Korean War and the Vietnam War, with the latter turning into a large-scale conflict that saw 2.2 million men drafted. The carnage and the complex loss that ensued led to the end of the American military draft. But it never quite went away. No one has been drafted into the military for 50 years, but every American male has to prepare for it. All men aged 18 to 25 have to be registered with Selective Service, which essentially maintains the infrastructure of the draft in case it's needed. Those who don't register can face civil penalties, such as not being able to get certain government benefits, but they can also potentially be prosecuted for a felony. However, no one has been prosecuted since 1986, making many people feel like the system is really just a formality at this point. And its time may be running out. For many people, the system is simply a theoretical problem by now, and they have major issues with how it's run. For one thing, women are still not required to register despite having fought for equality in countless other areas. It's one issue that both men's rights activists and feminists might agree on, and if there was a draft, it's not clear if this gender disparity would pass legal muster. Additionally, it's not clear if a random draw of young men would be the best way to handle conscription anymore, and other countries might have a different example. There are several countries around the world that have universal conscription, requiring all eligible citizens to serve several years in the military. These are typically the countries that have a potential military conflict on their border. South Korea only conscripts men as it gets ready for a potential revival of its war with North Korea, and it is notoriously strict with its requirements. Pop band BTS saw all of its members take a several years hiatus at the height of their career to serve, and some people say this might just be the ticket for the United States. In recent years, a small but vocal group in the USA have advocated for bringing back some form of conscription or national service. Some on the right who promote it think it might whip those Gen Z kids into shape and teach them some patriotism. Left-wing advocates like the late Congressman Charles Rangel argued that all volunteer military means the burden of military action isn't served evenly, and most people don't have a stake in the conflicts. However, neither of these arguments garnered much public support. But if things go in a certain direction, that could change. Is the US truly on the brink of World War III? Well, it's complicated. The US military hasn't been involved in any large-scale military conflicts since it left Afghanistan, but it's increasingly involved in support roles. In Ukraine, it provides weapons and defensive tech to the government against the Russian invasion, leading to many threats from Vladimir Putin. When Israel and Iran went to war in 2025, the U.S. launched a surprise bombing raid to assist Israel in knocking out Iran's nuclear research facilities. And in the South China Sea and the Pacific, the U.S. Navy and China's fleet play a delicate game of brinksmanship over Taiwan and other territories. And then, of course, there is the occasional threat to make Canada the 51st state. But if things really go south, a lot of young people might find themselves wondering if they look good in khaki. No one knows what would happen if the draft came back in this current climate, but we would likely see a movement against it at least as energetic as the one that happened during the Vietnam War. Gen Z, who would be the majority of those drafted, tend to be one of the most politically iconoclastic and anti-war generations, and so it's likely that they would follow in the footsteps of those who disagreed during all the past wars and try to find out exactly how they can get out of the draft. But that is a lot easier said than done. The Vietnam War was the heyday of draft dodging for a number of reasons. It wasn't an existential war threatening the homeland. It was a particularly divisive war that many Americans opposed, and the media coverage of the conflict made it clear just how bad things were over there. The war lacked the patriotic fervor that drove the draft during the World Wars, and countless young men were looking for a way out of the war. And that led to many taking unconventional paths that would keep them out of combat. But a lot of those doors are closed today. For one thing, there were a lot more exemptions back then. The window for being drafted was only 18 to 25, but it only targeted single men. Initially, married men were exempt from the peacetime draft until 1965. This was because it was seen as a family hardship. Naturally, this led to a lot of young men getting married pretty quickly. Men with children were also exempt until 1970, and there was actually evidence that in 1969, women whose husbands had high draft numbers were statistically more likely to get pregnant. This exemption was eliminated in 1970, and it's not likely to come back if the draft does. And neither is this next free pass. For most of the Vietnam War, all you had to do to avoid being drafted was be in college. Students could get deferred until the conclusion of their degree, but graduate students were also exempt, so many men essentially became professional students. This was the most common way for well-off future politicians to escape the draft, but it was increasingly controversial. Many people correctly pointed out that this favored the upper-class individuals, and it was essentially another way of buying your way out of the draft. The majority of these deferments were eliminated in 1971. Times have changed, and this next method certainly won't pass muster. In the past, one of the most controversial ways of dodging the draft was to claim to be gay. Until the 2000s, it was illegal to serve in the U.S. military by being openly gay, so plenty of young men put on their best lisp and pretended to be the impression of their Uncle Milton, who runs a flower shop with his college roommate. Of course, the draft board were onto this, and they often put those men through a humiliating physical to test them and then see if they were truly committed to the ruse. But if they were often excused from service with a disgusted shrug. This obviously won't work today, but under the current administration, transgender individuals have been banned from serving, which means that many of today's draftees might go rummaging through their mom's closet for one of her old sundresses. The problem with that is Big Brother is watching. It's illegal to dodge the draft, and it's illegal to lie to federal officials, so the odds are anyone who lies about their identity would have to keep up the ruse for a while, and undercover agents could be watching to catch them in the act contradicting their story. This doesn't necessarily mean a ticket straight to jail, though. If someone tried to dodge the draft by falsely claiming a transgender identity, they might try to say they realized it wasn't who they truly were, and Uncle Sam's response wouldn't be sympathetic. It would more likely be, "Glad we cleared that up, son. Welcome to boot camp." And there are some other illegal ways to dodge the draft, but they might be a one-way trip. One of the most common ways people used to dodge the draft during Vietnam was by heading north to Canada. The Great White North wasn't involved in the war, and they didn't approve of the United States' involvement. They refused to extradite the draft dodgers, and it's estimated that at least 30,000 Americans fled there. The problem is, by fleeing, they committed a serious crime, and returning to the United States would likely have meant jail time. The Vietnam-era crew got a major gift from President Jimmy Carter when he pardoned all the draft dodgers in 1977. But if the draft was to come back, the next president might not be so generous. Besides, it's harder to get into Canada now, with a passport being needed, which means those facing the draft would be caught at the border. Which means heading south might be the better strategy. Mexico is one of the most popular tourist destinations for Americans, particularly the party city of Tijuana. While passports are required, security getting in is usually less stringent than it is in Canada. While someone already in the draft system might get flagged and barred from leaving the country, those who haven't officially been called up yet might take a different route. Literally, if they sense the draft is coming, they might just decide it's time for a long vacation across the border. Maybe a beachside Airbnb in Tijuana sounds a lot better than basic training. But dodging the draft this way comes with some serious risks. If the government tracks you down or relations with Mexico sour, getting back might be a lot harder than getting out. But even if you show up, that doesn't mean you're going into the army. After induction, the next step was usually the physical, where they determine if men are fit to go into the military. This was when many draftees tried to play fast and loose with their health. One common tactic was to try to gain a lot of weight, which would potentially make a man a load on their unit. But given the average shape of the American male today, the military might be more likely to say, "Okay, we'll get you into shape." Others pretended to be out of their gourd, ranting to act like they were insane, but that stood the risk of working too well and getting someone involuntarily confined to a mental hospital. And then, of course, there is the more high-risk option. For men who were bound and determined that they would not be sent abroad, they would sometimes take extreme acts of injuring themselves, breaking a leg by jumping off a roof or even shooting off some toes. This dates back hundreds of years, and it was usually considered a form of desertion which could be punished by death in the Civil War. By the time Vietnam rolled around, the punishments were smaller, and this was one of the more effective ways of getting out of the draft. After all, they couldn't prove it wasn't a hunting accident, and they can't make Johnny walk straight again. But this does carry the risk of doing the job a little too well and winding up disabled for life. So for the majority of potential draftees, they're likely to take another, more sensible route. If someone doesn't want to serve, there is a path of getting out of it, but it's complicated and it puts you at the mercy of the government. This is called conscientious objector status, and it's reserved for those who have a deep-seated conviction that they cannot go to war for moral, religious, or political reasons. The process for this usually involves going before the draft board and pleading your case. However, those draft boards were typically composed of strict, no-nonsense volunteers who deeply believed in the cause, so it was an uphill battle. And for those who pulled it off, they often had to think outside of the box. The most famous conscientious objector in history was likely Desmond Doss, a young World War II draftee who was a devout Seventh-day Adventist. This included a deep belief in nonviolence, and Doss appealed to be able to go to war without a weapon. But there was a big twist to this tale. Doss hadn't actually tried to get out of the draft. He had volunteered and asked to be able to do his duty as a medic instead. He was granted his wish and he served in the Pacific Theater, where he saved up to 75 men, receiving the Medal of Honor for his efforts. But for those who want to stay out of the fray, it'll be much harder. The vast majority of conscientious objectors were rejected in the Vietnam War. Most objections centered around being opposed to the war, and there was also quite a few black men who objected to being sent overseas to fight an elective war for a country that didn't give them rights. These objections were presented to older patriotic draft board members who were not likely to be sympathetic, and the objectors were often told they had two choices: strap on a uniform and do your duty, or go to prison. And many chose the latter. Most famously, iconic boxer Muhammad Ali refused to go to Vietnam and served time in prison. This might be the most foolproof method for getting out of the draft, with a cost. In the past, refusing a call-up notice could mean a death sentence if the king deemed it so. But now, the few years in prison that come with a draft refusal might seem like a fair price to pay for those who were dead set on not going. The term in prison will vary depending on the law at the time and the judge, but it's unlikely to go on past the war, although the social consequences of this choice might be severe. However, surprisingly, the most effective way to dodge the draft might be joining the military. One of the most common ways for rich kids to dodge the draft was for their parents to get them a cushy position in the Air National Guard or the Naval Reserve. They would most likely spend the war doing test flights or maintaining ships rather than going to the battlefield. This got them military service on their record too, convenient for a future political run. But even for many people without political connections, jumping the gun and signing up before your number was called was smart, because then you would be able to choose your position. Those drafted were most likely to serve in large army units. By contrast, someone who enlisted in the Air Force or the Navy early might be able to find themselves in a high-skill position with a bigger chance of surviving the war. And war has changed a lot since the draft was last in play. The reason the draft was such a factor during the World Wars was because a massive amount of manpower was needed. Even in Vietnam, large numbers of soldiers would be cycled in and out. The type of human wave attack is still common today. In Russia, where the country has a far-reaching draft, the country has even expanded the draft to all men under 30 years old, although it has actively been recruiting among older men, raising speculation that the age could be raised once again. In Ukraine, the country under attack by Russia, all men up to 25 are eligible for conscription, as both countries need large standing armies. But in the US, to fight in the war, you might not even need to be there. Around the United States, there are countless young men who spend their days playing video games, and they think they would never be fit for war. But the big news is, Uncle Sam might want you anyway. Today's wars are incredibly high-tech, with much of the battle being fought before it ever started, with drone surveillance and tactical bombing raids, often from unmanned planes. That means that the most valuable skill in the military right now might not be the ability to hold a gun. It's skilled hand-eye coordination and a familiarity with tech. They don't need mass numbers of soldiers, they need a few good gamers. So, should you sign up to avoid the draft? Hold off on those enlistment papers. There are many people opposed to the return of the draft, but none more so than the US military. For the last 50 years, the military has been composed of trained professional soldiers who signed up voluntarily and are willing and able to perform in military engagements. That's what the entire structure of the military is built around now, and a draft would be a massive upheaval. The military would have to deal with a massive influx of new troops, many of which are either unprepared or actively enraged to be there. And if there wasn't a high-level conflict, there would be very little to do with them, which would be a tinderbox waiting to explode. But world affairs could change that in a hurry, but maybe not as much as you think. What kind of conflict would actually cause a draft? It might not be the biggest one. It would be a conflict that would both be a serious threat to the US, as well as one that required a large amount of pure manpower. The clearest examples are wars on the domestic front, which would mean Mexico or Canada. While both countries have seen their fair share of saber-rattling from the current administration in recent months, neither is likely. Any conflict with Mexico would likely center around criminal elements in that country, and it might be a joint operation with the Mexican government. As for Canada, despite the 51st state threats, polls show a strong bipartisan opposition to worsening relations with the US's northern neighbor, and the military is no fan either. But abroad, it is a different story. Iran is currently the country the US is closest to war with after the recent bombing raids. But Iran is located far away from the US, tends to use proxies to attack its enemies, and any larger conflict with the US would likely involve massive bombing raids by the Air Force rather than a large-scale ground invasion. It's also likely that Israel would be involved in any larger conflict with Iran, and it might take the lead in the war, allowing the US to play support in minimizing the need for manpower. Which means it's time to talk about the superpowers. There are three powerful entities that could lead to a conflict large enough to require conscription. The first, the EU, is the most unlikely. While the president has made noises about taking Greenland from Denmark by force, the US and Denmark are members of NATO. So it's likely the military would strongly disagree with any efforts to kickstart a military conflict with a NATO ally. But the same can't be said for another European country. In many ways, the Cold War never ended, and the US and Russia are still at each other's throats over Ukraine. Putin periodically makes bold threats of nuclear war over US weapons deliveries to his enemy. But it's highly unlikely this conflict will turn into a ground war. Everyone knows invading Russia is a nightmare, and if Putin kickstarts a war, it's likely to be done with missiles, which means the US would retaliate in kind. So if war with Russia starts, you probably won't have to worry about a draft, but that might not be a good thing. And that leaves one remaining conflict, and it could be the biggest yet. China has been expanding aggressively in the South China Sea and making noises about conquering Taiwan, which the US has vowed to defend. This could easily turn into a large-scale conflict in the Pacific and Asia. While China could resort to nuclear weapons and kick off an apocalyptic exchange, their leadership is seen as more pragmatic than Russia's, and would be more likely to try to win the war by conventional means. That means that the US could wind up being bogged down in a large-scale, complex war in several different regions of Asia and the Pacific. And they would initially try to win this war based heavily on the Navy and Air Force's superior hardware. More manpower could be needed, which would mean a return to the draft notice in the mail, or maybe it would be delivered by an app now. But even if that happens, it wouldn't be easy. The US military is not prepared for a draft, regardless of the infrastructure still being in place. This would require a very quick shift to training mass numbers of soldiers for a quick deployment, and the process of that is much trickier than it was in the past when the war for the grunts was simple and brutal. The public doesn't want a draft, and the military doesn't want one, which means the best way to avoid one might be everyone takes a breath and just tries to be cool. Shouldn't be a problem, right? But let's just say the draft does come knocking, and you decide to ghost Uncle Sam. Check out what happens when you go AWOL to find out what happens next, or click on this video instead.